Okay. Hi, everybody. It's 3 after, so I think we'll go ahead and get started, and hopefully other folks will join. We've got a good audience here and a great group of speakers, so we want to be careful of everyone's time. My name is Thomas Opel. I'm the Executive Vice President of the American Sustainability, and on behalf of ASBC and our co-host, the National Cooperative Business Association, and our panelists and partners, I'd like to welcome everybody to today's webinar on worker ownership. ASBC is a powerful coalition of business organizations and companies committed to advance market solutions and policies at the state and national level to support a vibrant, just, and sustainable economy. ASBC and its organizational members represent more than 250,000 businesses across the U.S., including many employee stock ownership companies, benefit corporations, and cooperatives. ASBC's High Road business initiatives have had significant effect on both the implementation of federal and state public policies and the understanding by legislators and regulators that such practices encourage greater shared prosperity. The Main Street Employee Ownership Act, one example, passed on a bipartisan basis in 2018, is one of the areas our speakers will review in their remarks today, but it represents encouraging first results of our collective efforts together to advance the idea of worker ownership. And the purpose of the webinar is to update everyone on current trends, developments, initiatives in this rapidly evolving and growing worker ownership field. Worker-owned enterprises are more resilient. They increase workers' retirement security, democratize the workplace, support succession planning, reduce income inequality, and can provide worker owners with a voice, a vote, and an equity share. So let me introduce our great panel today. Speaking first will be Matthew Gomez, who is counsel to the U.S. House Small Business Committee, chaired by Congresswoman Nydia Velázquez. And Matt will detail what's going on in Congress, the challenges in getting the Small Business Administration to change criteria to provide loans to co-ops, and the need for change in legislation and regulation at the federal level. Following will be Doug Bryan, the President and CEO of the National Cooperative Business Association, our partner and co-host in this webinar. And he'll talk about the importance of co-ops and ownerships as a strategy to address retirement crises, generational transfer of wealth, and succession planning. And then third, we have Dan Wolfe, President of Cape Air, former Massachusetts State Senator and a member of ASBC, who will talk about ESOP culture, blessings and challenges, as well as the strategy to address the retirement crisis and income inequality. And last, but certainly not least, Michael Peck, the co-founder and executive director of One Worker, One Vote, and ASBC board secretary, will offer a forward-looking picture of new ecosystem-based ownership initiatives, focusing on one of those initiatives in Cincinnati, Ohio, and he'll describe how to move to hybrid models, starting with union co-ops. Just one logistical issue. Once the presentations are made, we're going to try and leave as much time as possible for your questions. If you have a question, please don't use the chat box. Please write your questions in the question box. It's probably at the bottom of your screen, and it's probably marked Q&A. And so the last thing I'll say is many of the issues being discussed today will be further discussed in depth during ASBC's December 10th and 11th summit in DC, Making Capitalism Work for All. And you can learn more by visiting www.asbcouncil.org. So without further ado, let me introduce Matt Gomez to start us off. Matt?
Hey, thank you there. So good afternoon to everyone who's listening in on the webinar. You know, I want to thank you for the invite and for you know, for all the great work that you're doing in terms of not just providing you know, economic development and you know, promoting you know, the right kind of business growth for our local economies, but also for being the strong advocates that you are for these kind of initiatives. So I'd like to just kind of give a little bit of an update from the Hill in terms of implementation of the Main Street Act, and then kind of where our vision is, you know, going forward, what the push could look like. So I can say, you know, right now a few things. We are working on a letter to the SBA, following up on the various provisions of the Main Street Act and SBA's implementation of them. I think particularly looking at the SBDC component of it, there's a little bit of outreach that the agency has been required to do. I'm not sure that has happened yet, so we need to follow up on that. And generally the other, outreach components of it that have been, there's just been no follow-up from them to us on that, so we must, we're going to send them a letter soon enough. Like I said, we're working on that right now. So more on that, but we will be following up on the implementation of the bill. As another piece of follow-up from the Main Street Act, we also are in receipt of the co-op lending report. It was rather brief. I was expecting to print it out and take it home and read it and kind of really go through it. But when I got it, I just kind of told myself, I can read this on the train. I'll be done with it before I get to the Pentagon. And I was done with it before I got to the Pentagon, which is to say it took me about 3 minutes to read. I was not very thrilled when I read it. It's my way of saying I was a little bit frustrated at how brief it was. I think our hope in requiring a report was that SBA would come to the table with its own ideas for how co-ops can get around the personal guarantee requirement. It's our understanding that various other government agencies provide financing and do not require a personal guarantee. There are other ways to secure the loan. USDA was at the table and offered some ideas. I think some of the industry was at the table and gave some of your own ideas as well. The report really just made clear that the SBA did not do much of what we were hoping they would do. Instead, it really just kind of looks like they shot down every idea that was offered and kind of wrote them off in a kind of, to me at least, was a little bit unsatisfactory the way that they just kind of out of hand said, no, it's not a good idea because of this. Oh, it's not a good idea because of that. And then all they really told us was, well, we're going to do, our plan is to, increase education efforts about how our programs work, which to me was, I interpreted that as like, you guys don't know how SBA works. We need a personal guarantee requirement, and here's why. Well, I'm prepared to push back and say to them, why does it work for all these other agencies and not you guys? So I think there's a little bit of SBA modernization that needs to happen there because I think it's true that other agencies can do it. So why the heartburn, right? So we're also in receipt of the coalition letter. I think about 90 or so, maybe it's over 100 now. Different groups out there have signed on, which is great, calling on a hearing on this issue. And let me just say, message received. It's very palpable, the degree of frustration that is out there right now. Like I said, message received, and I can say it that on my behalf at the staff level, I'm prepared to make that recommendation to the chairwoman that we hold a formal hearing on this issue, so that, let's see if it winds up on the 2020 calendar. All I'm empowered to do really is make the recommendation. So I'm there. So I've told my supervisor that, I recommend we do one earlier in the 2020 calendar, but I'll keep pressing on that. And I think part of my recommendation memo will talk about how, it can serve two functions. A hearing like that can really, or some other big engagement piece, it could be a briefing, a roundtable, some other big engagement piece on the Hill where staff is invited, can serve a couple of functions. First of all, narrowly in my SBA space, can keep pressure on SBA to get those loans out to employee-owned businesses, right? And to otherwise generally do right by you all as a community. The co-op lending report is not a good sign. There's at least one proposed reg where, implementing the bill saying, Bill said you got to do these loans on delegated authority. That's Congress, and then the SBA comes back and says you shall not do it on delegated authority. So I am at a point where I'm sufficiently frustrated as a staffer about agency disregarding congressional intent that I think it merits a hearing. And like I said, I'm working on that recommendation memo, and hopefully the argument will hopefully the argument I end up making in that memo will be clear enough. But I think the hearing can serve at least that one purpose, to keep the pressure on SBA, keep it high on our radar as a committee, that we're not letting this go, that we're still paying attention to. And I think by having that level of engagement really puts a pressure on the agency. That's one. Number two, it could also serve to broaden the push for enhanced employee ownership across other policy areas, right? So, I mean, I've heard chatter about potential fixes to the tax code that might be beneficial to co-ops and other employee-owned businesses. If it's a tax code fix, that's the Ways and Means Committee. They need to hear about those kind of initiatives. If there's, something immigration related where, somehow invoking an immigration status for your workers would be beneficial, or otherwise invoking that statute, well, that's the Judiciary Committee, and they ought to hear about those initiatives as well. And so it's, I think, a good thing that you wanted to start with the Small Business Committee, because it's a committee that is very much facing you as a community, and very narrowly so, very specifically so. But I think there's potential here for a lot more work that can be done with other committees in ways that we can enhance employee ownership. So that's really, in a nutshell, the update from the Hill. I look forward to hearing the kind of other perspectives and seeing maybe there's something that I've missed that the Small Business Committee should be looking at that we're not currently. If that's the case, I look forward to having those dialogues with you all. But that's really, update from the Hill. That's it in a nutshell. So thank you very much again for the opportunity. And I look forward to chatting with you all further offline in the near future. Thank you.
Great, thanks, Matt. And next we'll hear from Doug O'Brien, the President and CEO of the National Cooperative Business Association. Doug?
Hello, yeah, this is Doug O'Brien. Really appreciate the opportunity to be with everyone today, in particular with our colleagues from ASBC. Great to partner with you on this webinar and so many other things. And Matt, thank you so much for being here today. Thank you even more for your leadership and your boss's leadership on the Hill. It's been really transformational thus far, and there's a lot more good work to do. I'm just going to talk a little bit about policy, and then I want to talk about conversions. But first, just the 1 minute on who is the National Cooperative Business Association, CLUSA International. We're the apex, the umbrella organization for all kinds of cooperatives, including worker cooperatives, as well as agriculture, food, credit union, housing cooperatives, and other types of cooperatives. Been around for about 103 years. We do advocacy, we do public awareness, we do development, we do thought leadership, and we partner with ASBC. One of our great members on our board is the U.S. Federation of Worker Co-ops, and so we've been excited to work more and more in this field around worker co-ops and worker ownership. It's such an important piece of our work today because of the opportunity and the need for more use of worker co-ops. Just picking up on policy for a bit on what Matt was talking about. First, I just want to emphasize how important it is to continue to work with and to help SBA find solutions so that more people can use that critical agency in financing worker-owned businesses. And we've been working with a lot of folks. We're continuing to keep that as an absolute priority. And as Matt said, it's an example of if we really want to transform, if we really want millions of more people to own the businesses where they work, we need to have a scaffolding of federal policy as well as state policy to make that happen. And the reason I say that so definitively is that from where I get to sit, I've seen what happens when Congress and when state legislatures act, and they create policies that allow and encourage people who use the business to own, control, and benefit from that business. And we've seen it with rural electric cooperatives where, the vast majority of people who live in the rural parts of this country, they own their energy generation and distribution utilities and their cooperatives. And one of the reasons that happened is because of a comprehensive federal policy infrastructure. Another example is in agriculture where In nearly every sector, there's in agriculture, there's a significant part of it that's owned and controlled and benefit the farmers who grow the food, and that's everything from Ocean Spray and Land O'Lakes to Sunkist and Welch's. So, and that happened again because of policy, and it needs to happen for worker-owned. Now, this is the moment that we're in. We call it here at NCBA Inclusive, we're in a cooperative moment. When people feel excluded from their economy and from their society, that's a time when people are looking for solutions that empower, more people that are closer to the ground. In NCBA's case, the strategy that we've seen and has gone to scale and has really worked is allowing people, to in that democratic form of business called cooperatives. So, there's the opportunity is largely because, and one of the reasons it's such a great opportunity right now is because of the turnover in small businesses that we are just on the front of, and it's because of, what a lot of people call the silver tsunami or the baby boomers as they move from owning their own businesses to their next chapter in life. There's an opportunity for the people that work at those businesses to own and control those businesses through cooperatives and through ESOPs. You look at the numbers and, half of all small businesses right now that baby boomer generation owns. That could translate to 10 to 15 million jobs that will sort of be in flux. And there's a huge question, who will own those businesses? Whether that's in an urban center in the suburbs or in a small town in rural America, in many cases, the best solution, and many times maybe the only solution, if that business is going to continue, are the people who own, or they're the people who work at that business. And for that to happen, there needs to be better technical assistance, there needs to be better financing, there needs to be better public awareness, and that's why we're so excited to be working with ASBC, to be working with the U.S. Federation of Worker Co-ops, to be working with members of Congress such as and their staff, such as Matt Gomez, on making this happen. So I look forward to the questions, and just really glad to be part of this conversation today.
Thanks very much, Doug. And next, we're going to hear from Dan Wolfe with Cape Air and an ASBC member. Dan?
Yes, good afternoon, everybody, or maybe some people, it's still morning, but good afternoon and morning. Cape Air, I think, serves in today's presentation of a living, real example of how an ESOP can be successful. And really, the lessons learned through the maturing and maturity of our ESOP. We've been an ESOP company now for 25 years. And one of the things I always say is the ESOP doesn't create a culture. It doesn't create a set of values. It reflects a set of values and a culture that already exists. So I think part of the discussion today relative to shared prosperity and some of the other points that people are bringing up is that part of the education that we have to do is to make sure that there's fertile territory in which ESOPs can grow. Cape Air has been an ESOP company since about 1995, 96. So we're going into our 25th year. We started the ESOP with about 250 employees. At our peak, we were about 1,200 employees. We're just around 1,000 right now, a little under 1,000. We started with a 30% ESOP, which is what you need the minimum, as many of you know, to trigger the tax treatment. And we sort of vary. And I think, a couple of the financial lessons learned that I really think we need to focus on as we talk to policymakers and as we try to create more opportunities for companies who have the desire to do this, but not necessarily the opportunity to do it. One is on the formation end. I'm hearing things like personal guarantees, and I also serve on the board of the largest regional bank here, and I've been a board member of that bank for the last 25 years. And to break through with traditional lending institutions or equity partners relative to having this conversation is much harder than it should be, since ESOPs have been around a long time. So I think part of this, as I've been hearing, not just at the SBA, but through the entire finance community, is to really talk about what the inherent risks are in financing ESOPs, and without a personal guarantee, why they can still be a really safe and good vehicle to back. The other thing I will say as a mature or maturing ESOP is it's vitally important, and depending on your age, those of you on the call, some of you will remember the Enron debacle, and some of you will scratch your heads, but you can Google it. When we concentrate the risk, the retirement risk of our employees in the company they work at, while I totally get the shared prosperity part, we also have to be mindful of, on an individual basis, what makes sense for the employees. And we didn't think about that for probably the first 10 years we did the ESOP, but as we matured and we had employees leave, and as we looked at retirement portfolio, because we have a 401k here as well, it became more and more important that we deal with the issue of liquidity and diversity as it relates to the employee shares being held. And of course, when you do that, you want to make sure that the shares that become liquid get circulated back into the ESOP, that they don't get taken out. Otherwise, what happens is over time, the ESOP diminishes and ultimately goes away. But there's a huge financial component relative to that diversification and liquidity as well. Our employees have the opportunity every year to roll 25% of their ESOP holdings into their 401k. Both, of course, living under the Part 125 ERISA plan regulations. So, that works. As far as the tax incentives, boy, I'll tell you, they're great, because now that they're a lot more liberal as far as converting from a C Corp to an S Corp. An S Corporation that is 100% ESOP virtually pays no income tax because all of the flow through income goes to a tax exempt or tax deferred entity. So, I think the tax laws and structures right now, at least as far as ESOP are concerned, not necessarily as far as co-ops and other alternative ownership structures. The tax policies are there in place to I think really facilitate the proliferation of more ESOPs. One of the things I am advocating, and I will continue to, as important as it is in the legislature and is in the committees in the legislature, both at state and federal levels, is also the executive branch. And I've talked about it with some of the leaders on the line and beyond, that I think depending on the outcome of 2020, we should be strongly advocating for a White House Council on alternative ownership structures, so that it really becomes embedded in the dialogue at a national level. And of course, at a state level, our governors, to the degree that those states where we can get it in, it should also come from the executive branch as well. So, I would just repeat that we're a huge advocate. We're a living example. I really look forward to hearing Michael's comments, because our pilots have been in the Teamsters Union for about 12 years now, so that, we have organized labor here. One of the things that I've had informal discussions, both with the AFL-CIO and Teamsters, is the whole idea of using retirement fund money and other vehicles that we have worker engaged large sums of money in, to actually help finance and leverage some of the ESOP opportunities. I've also been to Bain Capital and some of the other big finance and investment organizations, and they really look at me with a big question mark when I talk about financing, using traditional equity and debt to finance ESOPs. And I think one of the huge advantages, which they really don't get intuitively anyway, is that a lot of the tax benefit actually makes it a safer investment and can enhance a greater return on the investment. So there is so much education that we can do. I think the policy part is important, but I really think we need to embed the concept of ESOP and shared ownership into the idea of where our economy is relative to justice and wealth and income inequality, and where we want to take it relative to shared prosperity. And it's not nearly enough of that conversation. And the other thing, and I loved, Doug, when you talked about the whole idea that ownership structure to a large degree determines the outcome and behavior of a corporation, such that when you have grower cooperatives, for example, or I would say even if the people who are eating the food are the ones growing it, they will be a lot more mindful of the practices when you have the people using the electricity also involved in how it's created relative to environmental impact. It just is very powerful. The last thing I'd like to say before going to questions, because I love the question part, is that when you have frontline oriented businesses, and there are no more frontline oriented businesses than airlines, as you all know, when you check in at a flight and you're dealing with somebody who owns a company versus a relatively uninspired, unengaged employee who is sort of watching the clock tick, you will experience an entirely different transportation experience. And so that goes with our bag handlers, it goes with our ticket agents, it goes with our reservation agents, it goes with our pilots, it goes with our mechanics. An airline, like so many of our businesses, are driven at the front line. They're the ones who really determine the fate or success of the operation. And our experience in 25 years is it's a total sea change, that it really does make a difference to have the frontline employees as owners. And finally, if that's the case, it gives us a real responsibility to make sure that our frontline employees are educated, informed, knowledgeable. We do open book management here. We have a lot of what we call town meetings where I and the other leaders are out meeting with frontline employees, giving incredibly boring, long-winded presentations on how the company is doing, what our strategic plan is, and what their share is. We also do profit sharing here at Cape Air. So not only are our employees benefiting from ownership, but we have a very aggressive profit sharing plan, which we do. Again, a consistent value and a consistent mechanism to have in an ESOP company. So I think I look forward to the questions. I think that's sort of where I'm coming from on this. On the legislative side, as I think was said at the beginning, I did do 3 terms in the state legislature here in Massachusetts as a state senator. I was the chair for the entire 6 years I was in of the Labor and Workforce Development Committee. And just continue, I mean, I'll just reaffirm what I said earlier. There is just total ignorance and lack of education on both sides of this, both on the labor side, unfortunately, but also on the equity, management, and debt side of the equation. Thanks a lot. What an honor to be able to be speaking with everybody today.
Hey, Dan, thank you. And as somebody who's spent a lot of time on your Boston to Lebanon, New Hampshire leg for the last 20 years, I can just affirm what you said about your employees and the value of ownership and how they treat their customers. So, so thank you, sir. And last, again, not least, is Michael Peck, the co-founder and executive director of One Worker, One Vote. Michael?
Well, thank you, Thomas. And following the presentations of Matt, Doug, and Dan, I do feel it's a question of last and least. And there's no honor. There's no dishonor in being least with a team like this. So One Worker, One Vote, the movement, we're a New York 501c3 nonprofit. We launched in the spring of 2015 as a direct result of the October 2009 agreement between United Steelworkers and Mondragon International, this really famous precedent-setting collaboration agreement that was intended as an antidote to the ravages of the 2008 Great Recession, which I know everybody here recalls quite well, because those ravages are still with us in terms of unemployment, stagnant wages, a lack of sustainable housing, all sorts of racism in the workplace, lack of mobility, and really the American dream divided into less than the 1% for the 0.00 something percent and something else for everybody else. So Mondragon, headquartered in the Basque region of Spain, is the world's largest industrial cooperative corporation with upwards of 16 billion in sales, 72,000 people globally, with its own university, its bank, and insurance mutual. United Steelworkers is North America's largest manufacturing union, co-founder of the Apollo Alliance, the Blue-Green Alliance, the Alliance for American Manufacturing, and also partnered with Unite, which is the second largest union in the UK. The United Steelworkers, the Ohio Center for Employee Ownership, and Mondragon International's North American delegate, accompanied by leaders of the US cooperative movement representing NCBA and the Rural Electric Cooperatives, NCBA that Doug now presides over, presented our union co-op model template in March 2012 in the atrium of the Steelworkers International headquarters in Pittsburgh after a 2-year period of public reflection and consensus building once we announced our collaboration in 2009. I think this is really important because when you go back to history, in the 1840s, unions and co-ops started from the same place at the same time. We all know about the Rochdale pioneers and the Rochdale framers in Northwest UK, in the manufacturing belt of the UK. Unions and co-ops started from the same impetus for equality and opportunity, and they've diverged over time, and all we're doing is renewing that bond. Unions know how to punch above their weight. They bring solidarity to the fight, and cooperatives bring economic democracy and critical mass, and together they are indomitable. So currently, One Worker, One Vote is blessed with 10 co-founders and 8 members of our National Advisory Board. One Worker, One Vote is an ASBC member, as Thomas said. As co-founders, the Cincinnati Union Cooperative Initiative operates as our prototyping living lab for the One Worker, One Vote movement. And we also have CUNY Law School's Community Economic Development Clinic in New York City leads our intellectual property, legal, and alliance structuring work. So those are the 2 international framers of the One Worker, One Vote movement. And we work policy through NCBA and ASBC. Some global partners include key leaders from Mondragon and the Preston UK Cooperative Development Network. Preston is the model UK success story for Britain's Labour Party. Harvard Business School has written a case study on us. To answer Dan's point, we collaborate with over 30 unions and also with leading global strategists such as Oliver Wyman. So I think the next time you want to make a pitch to those banks, Dan, our friends at Oliver Wyman might be helpful there. We partner again with ASBC and NCBA on anything they ask us to, but specifically worker ownership policy. We focus on developing economic self-reliance, inclusive entrepreneurship, and civic equity culture in frontline communities across America by localizing 65 plus years of the Mondragon worker cooperative ecosystem principles and practices. Next slide. One Worker, One Vote helps to launch for-profit hybrid model enterprise ecosystems and projects that are worker owned and managed. A good example is Cincinnati. Next slide. This is the Cincinnati ecosystem. It's really amazing because it's totally organically developed. It's totally inclusive. It's hard to find an activist group in Cincinnati that's not part of this ecosystem. It's profit focused. It does open book budgeting. You spend a lot of time explaining what you're doing to the ecosystem. A lot of lessons learned. And we have a big conference where practitioners come from all over the country and all over the world. I'll talk about that a little bit more, but we welcome you to come join us because this is really how it happens in the trenches and how we build an economy that works for all from the bottom up. Research proves, as some of our speakers have already mentioned, that combining an equity stake with a participatory ownership culture, which is essentially the definition of a worker cooperative, creates better businesses and better societies. We follow the 10 Mondragon principles. That includes the 7 international cooperative principles. We believe in organically developed ecosystems. We believe in single class stock to harmonize solidarity. We believe in one worker, one vote economic democracy. We definitely believe and practice sweat equity. We follow profitability and aim for profitability because if you're not profitable, you can't afford your values. And we form mission-driven enterprises and we participate in continuous learning. We joined Thomas and the ASBC team in welcoming all participants to the ASBC Making Capitalism Work for All conference here in on December 10th here in DC. And again, the One Worker, One Vote Cincinnati Union Cooperative Initiative Biennial Symposium on November 15th and 16th. It's called Liberating Our Futures Together, Building the Cooperative Ecosystem. We welcome you there. Our movement is about defining our best future of work, overcoming inequalities through better structures, building stakeholder opportunities, workplace freedom, and self-fulfillment through more inclusive, broadened, and deepened ownership in an economy that works for all. Next slide. You can see the impact that we've generated in society, again, starting from nothing. Next slide. You can see this is also the 2009 Mondragon USW Agreement. And this is also our constant referral back to Mondragon. Here we are with one of the founders of Saulan, which is the Mondragon Business Incubator. Next slide. And again, here is the slide that talks about our symposium. So, you know, we have all sorts of different projects. We've learned that there is no sector and no project that can't have a collective bargaining agreement and can't be a worker cooperative. And what's so interesting about the union cooperative is that the unions count their members, the cooperative counts their members. There's a collective bargaining agreement, and the worker owner gets to have it on both sides. The worker gets to decide or advocate for the highest possible wage and benefits that he or she want to negotiate. And the owner part of that worker owner is pushing for the best rising equity play. And there is an inherent contradiction between equity and wages and benefits, as anybody who is an owner and a worker knows. But resolving that contradiction in the individual experience of every single worker in America is called freedom, workplace freedom and self-fulfillment. And we think everybody should be allowed to have that opportunity. With that, I'll say thank you, and we'll turn it over to questions.
Okay, great. Again, let me remind you, if you've got questions, please put them in the question box. If you're raising your hand, it would be better if you could just indicate that you have a question and indicate it in the question box. Let me, before we go to some of the audience questions, let me just, Matt, let me come back to you and ask you, shouldn't this be a bipartisan issue? It seems like, you know, your Republican colleagues talk about ownership a lot. Isn't worker ownership truly, or shouldn't it be a bipartisan issue? And is it really?
I thank you for the question. Short answer is yeah. I don't know. Hard to identify the exact reason, at least from my perspective, about why there'd be any hesitance on this. You know, Main Street Act was done in a bipartisan fashion. Why it is that more Republicans aren't leading the way on this is a question. I think it's kind of open to me, but I think that, you know, it's, you know, I think it's back to Dan's point about education. Maybe there's an education gap, at least on the Republican side, about why these business structures work. And you know, the kind of impact that they can have for local communities. And so I would echo Dan's point about education, and maybe that's the point we need to get across is, you know, for whatever reason there's hesitation. Does it have to do with worker empowerment, and, you know, Republicans are skeptical about that because, you know, that's not traditionally, you know, the side that they choose in that whole, you know, dynamic. But let's demystify that for skeptical Republicans. And, you know, what I would encourage, you know, folks on the webinar to do is approach them in their districts, right? Get your members, invite them out to you know, to your business and show them why it works. And like I said before, just demystify it. That would be one thing. The second thing would be, you know, make a contact here in DC with, you know, if one of your members are a local Republican, you know, reach out to them when you're here in DC for the conference in December and try to schedule a meeting up here. It would probably help if you made the contact locally in the district first and then said, hey, remember the meeting we had in the district office? We're going to be back up in DC next month. Let's follow up. Let's meet again in DC. And now you've made a second contact. I think doing that would be a good start at helping enhance the education piece of it, and further along the potential bipartisanship for all this. So that's kind of, you know, the answer to the question is, yeah, it should be more bipartisan. And as to why it's not more so, I think there's an education gap, and I think there needs to be, you know, like let's just bring it back down to basics. And don't you support small businesses? Answer to that would be yes. Okay, here's a new form of a small business, you know, and take it from there.
Thanks, Matt.
Could I weigh in on that too a little bit?
Absolutely.
This will be a little bit less sort of benign than that. And I don't think this is partisan, but I think there are my experience is there are policymakers who don't necessarily make the connection between the democracy that we stand for as part of the American dream and our political system, and the relationship between the need in order to have that to somewhat democratize our economy as well. And I don't think that, you know, I'm the person who advocated for education, but I also think there is going to be tension in this dialogue, because there are people who fundamentally represent those who are fine that the rules of the game concentrate and don't share prosperity. And there are those of us in the policy end who want to promote policies that continually are a corrective force in the natural rules of our economic system, which is to concentrate wealth and to allow investors to extract much of it from the workplace. So I think that dialogue has to happen. And as sort of a populist dialogue as we go through the political process, we should be supporting people who make that connection. And we should be challenging people who don't make that connection, who think that the market is just going to behave on its own without us implementing policies that are corrective to a vibrant economy, although in its vibrancy, it concentrates.
Yes, this is Michael. I totally agree with that, Dan. We say here that there are no invisible hands in the real marketplace, and the free marketplace is still to be found.
Okay. Let me, thanks everybody. Let me maybe sort of as a segue, we have a question from Mindy who asks, how common is it for traditional owned businesses to convert to a co-op, and how do they go about it? Is that, Doug, is that something you can handle?
I'm happy to start. I think it is a growing, but still rather nascent strategy that business owners and their employees are engaging in. We see the numbers of businesses that are looking to converting to worker co-ops growing, by double digits in terms of percentage. Their numbers are still, in the hundreds. We know that, both from the experience within worker co-ops, but also when we look at other co-ops, other types of sectors within the co-op, that that for something to really go to scale, for an idea to really transform, there needs to be robust technical assistance. There needs to be a finance ecosystem that works for all the parties, and there needs to be a high degree of public awareness. And while, we're working on all three of those things, and in many ways have made great strides, the community that's supporting worker co-ops in the past 5 or 10 years, we look forward to continued growth. Now, ESOPs have a different story than worker co-ops, and one that maybe others on the call are better equipped to talk to than me.
Well, I had a question, actually, a caller, somebody talked to me yesterday about this webinar. They were looking for information, they wanted to participate. And they apparently thought ESOPs were the only form of worker ownership. Is that, do we think that's a common misunderstanding?
Well, I do think that ESOPs are better understood. They certainly have been used by a lot more businesses and workers. And I think there is, one of the themes from this call, one of the themes from a lot of conversations that we have, there's a lot of opportunity to increase public awareness as well as other stakeholders and policymakers. But I think there's increasing awareness. I mean, we've certainly seen, in fact, I think the activity around the Main Street Employee Ownership Act, which encompassed policy that affected both ESOPs and worker co-ops, but that in itself was sort of a big step towards a lot more stakeholders understanding that the co-op business model can be used for workers as members. We've seen it. We just had, that is, NCBA Inclusive just had its annual Co-op Impact Conference here about 2 weeks ago, and we had a panel, again, we've done this before, of state and local policymakers that came to talk about the work that they're doing in the state of Massachusetts, in Madison, in other cities and locales, and we've seen definitely an uptick in the appreciation and the interest. And I think the reason, and then I'll end, is it's what we've talked about here. Policymakers are hungry for ideas that will empower the people, empower workers, strategies that can actually address inequality and inequity. And, in cooperatives and ESOPs are one of those strategies. We, in fact, here at NCBA CLUSA about 3 months ago, we drafted and posted an open letter to all the presidential candidates, both sides of the aisle, and we've had conversations with many of those campaigns on how to make sure that the co-op business model, and we really call out worker co-ops in that letter, to be a basic part of their platform. It's a proven model, it's gone to scale, and it needs to come to, to the worker sector in a very big way.
Yes, I totally agree with that, Doug. This is Michael. To add, ASBC has an Ownership for All campaign that we've been developing. And one of the things that we are advocating for is tax parity among the different ownership areas, because, what we want to achieve is have people hosting communities and local entrepreneurs, stakeholders, pick the model that's best for them, not necessarily the model that investors like because it has the most benefits. And so in America, it always works when people have a choice. And we want to provide a choice that can be localized as deeply as possible. One of the pushbacks against, sort of democratizing avenues to share ESOP tax advantages with co-ops, worker co-ops, hybrid models like union co-ops is, it's expensive. ESOP, as Dan will attest, having ESOP is expensive, and we've been looking at the idea of a shared services co-op that could help lower the costs for everybody on a nationwide basis. The other point that I would make is that this is all about allowing people to really follow the do-it-yourself, self-reliance, mainstream values that have allowed this country to be successful, but being inclusive, so that those who have been left out are now included in the new prosperity. That's why we believe so strongly in one worker, one vote, in hybrid models. We're a hybrid nation, a nation of immigrants. Hybridity is what we do best, and right now we're focusing on union co-ops, bringing two very important communities together. But in the future, there'll be other communities that will have a hyphen in their name, and they will be brought together, and we're just laying the pathway for them.
Let me ask you, for all of you, we have another question about whether someone is asking about any recommendations on books or where people can get more information.
So Doug, you might want to take that.
Yeah, I'll start on the worker co-op end. I want to point to one of our key members at NCBA CLUSA and that I've mentioned before. It's the U.S. Federation for Worker Co-ops. They're laser focused on helping grow the worker co-op sector. They have an associated kind of think tank, the Democracy at Work Institute, does some great studies and reports on some of the dynamics, the trends, the opportunities and challenges for worker co-ops. I'll mention the work of Joe Blasi, who is a professor and a director of a center at Rutgers. He's also a member of NCBA CLUSA's Council of Co-op Economists. He has a number of books and articles that really focus on worker co-ops as well as ESOPs. Those are three that jump right to mind that are some great resources to go more deeply. And of course, I have to mention ncbaclusa.coop is our website, and we have a quarterly journal with some long-form research-based articles, the Cooperative Business Journal. Many of those are focused on worker co-op issues as well as other co-op issues, and of course we have many other resources on our website.
And if I could just, do a little shout out, most of you probably know about the Democracy Collaborative, Marjorie Kelly. She just came out with a book which is called The Making of a Democratic Economy. And there's a lot of good resource there as well.
And I like to add, in Cincinnati, they have something called Co-op Boot Camp, Worker Co-op Boot Camp, and also Co-op U. Also, we have the Ohio Employee Ownership Center, the Vermont Center for Employee Ownership, the Rocky Mountain Center for Employee Ownership, that are really well-versed in creating all sorts of ownership companies and spinning them out. So, coupled with everything that Doug and Dan have mentioned, there's quite a lot of sources to go to.
And I'll just remind folks that we are recording this, and it will be available on the ASBC website. As the slide says, the webinar will be posted there. So if you need to go back and review any of those recommendations, they'll be there on our website. We have one question, sort of a question, I guess, maybe an opinion, just what our four speakers think, making the comparison between the education gap that exists for worker ownership and maybe a similar education gap on the issue of Medicare for all. They're drawing that comparison. Any thoughts from any of our speakers?
Well, this is Dan speaking. A lot of thoughts on that. I mean, when you deal with issues in a democratic political system and a market-driven economy, the issues of justice and what our social goals are and shared prosperity are all fair game for discussion. I think more people would agree that everybody should have access to health care at this point than people would agree that everybody should have access to stock ownership. So I think there is a relationship around issues like sharing and shared prosperity and justice. And I think both of them are educational issues. So there's certainly a nexus there.
But also, you don't have to separate ownership from healthcare either, because when individual workers own their own healthcare portfolio, it's not dependent on where they work. It's dependent on them. People take much better care of their health and pay much more attention. Nobody believes that if the citizens of Flint, Michigan owned their own water utility, that Flint would have gone through the trials and tribulations in that area that they have. I remember when I worked on the Hill like Matt, and I was driving the member I supported around in Martinsburg, West Virginia, there was a big neon sign that says nobody washes a rental car. And I think that's really the approach that we're talking about.
Yeah.
There's a question from our audience that is essentially asking, and Michael, you may be the best person to answer this question, essentially says that the worker ownership cooperative model has been around for a couple of 100 years and seemed to be making some good traction in the 70s, but they feel like it's kind of stagnated since then. They're suggesting that there are a lot of organizations out there sort of trying to raise awareness, but are there any organizations with specific metrics, specific goals that say, we're going to have created X number of cooperatives, X number of worker organizations? And as I think about it, as I'm asking this question, I guess Michael and Doug are probably best suited to answer that question. And just keep in mind, guys, we're starting to run up against the time.
I think metrics are everything, and there's been a lot of studies done. Rutgers did one, University of Wisconsin at Madison did one, CUNY Law School, CUNY Economic Development Clinic has published stuff. Harvard Business School has looked at. It's all about the metrics, and the way that we're starting to convince financiers and public policy people who haven't quite understood that ownership is the rising tide only if everybody has a vote, is by showing that you can compete with classical enterprises when all the graphs are going up and everyone's a hero. But you really count who's who when the graphs are going down, and that's where worker enterprises do well. We can compete very well in profitable times, but in unprofitable times, we are more resilient than enterprises without ownership. And so if you are a midterm or a long-term value investor and you want to be profitable over time, not just for a quick hit, the metrics show that worker-owned enterprises are the way to go.
Doug,
yeah, the only thing I'd I'd add to that, and I, you know, the 50 by 50 is in many circles is a known goal, and I think an important one to look to. We just said as NCBA CLUSA just participated last week in the International Cooperative Alliance International Conference, and really one of the main themes there was talking about how to connect the work across the world to the Sustainable Development Goals, and I'd point to those 17 goals, you know, that have been adopted by so many around the world, and one of those is focused on decent work and economic growth. And you know, I think that the metrics are very important to keep people focused, but I do think that we have to continue to think about how worker ownership contributes to, you know, just a better quality of life and more economic opportunity. We have to measure that. We have to show that so that people like Matt Gomez, you know, that they have things that they can really show the policymakers that these strategies are transformational and they're the right strategies for today.
Thank you, sir. And I'm gonna wrap it up here as we come to the top of the hour. We want to thank all of our speakers today, and we want to thank all of you who have been listening for joining ASBC and NCBA for this webinar today. We hope it motivates you to action, and we hope most of all you please join the more than 250,000 responsible businesses excuse me, advocating for sustainable economic and environmental policies at www.asbcouncil.org. And another great place to start or to continue this conversation is ASBC Summit, Making Capitalism Work for All, on December 10th and 11th in Washington.
And the 29,000 cooperatives, most of whom are on Doug's organization.
Absolutely. And November, what are the dates? 15 and 16?
In Cincinnati.
In Cincinnati to learn more about cooperatives. Thank you all, and have a great rest of your day.